In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about the story of creation in Genesis in the Old Testament and how the story of Adam and Eve is related to humans being self-conscious.
The fundamental story of the first part of Genesis is predicated on the assumption that chaos can be conceptualized as a matrix, as something with a metaphorically female aspect. A matrix, by the way, a matrix is something out of which matter arises. It's the same word, matrix, matter, mother, those are all the same words. And one of the things that's very interesting about the word matter is that we use it in two ways, right? And I think it's a reflection of the tohu vabohu divide. One thing is things are made out of matter, and then the other thing is that things matter. And part of the Old Testament conceptualization of matter is that it's partly matter and partly what matters. And part of the Old Testament conceptualization of matter is that the world is made out of what matters. So, and I don't think that's a metaphor. I think your nervous system is actually set up in that manner because the way your brain reacts to the world is as if it matters. And since your brain evolved, and since we don't know any other way of producing an entity that can adapt to reality without evolution, then the fact that your brain evolved to treat the world as if it matters would indicate that the reason for that is because it matters. And I don't see any way out of that argument. So because the normal argument is the physical substrate is primary and anything that matters is epiphenomenal, right? That's part of the subjective or qualia. But I don't see any evidence whatsoever that that's how your brain is organized. I think all the evidence suggests the opposite. And that you're first attracted to what matters and then you parse it out into the world. I want to concentrate on the story of Adam and Eve. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it's an unbelievably illuminating story in the same way that the Mesopotamian story is illuminating. And I think it's staggering the degree to which the information in it has been compressed. Now, I think what happens, it's something like this. People are always telling stories about one thing or another. And they tell stories down the generations. And I think what happens is that as stories are handed down across the generations, all that remains of the stories is those elements that cannot be forgotten. And so what that means is that there's something centrally meaningful about those elements, because that's what you remember. You remember what's meaningful. You get rid of what isn't, right? So if I tell you the story of what I did today and you go off to someone else and you retell the story, you're going to compress it down to just a few lines. And those are the few lines that in some sense seem to sum up the entire story. And that's the part you didn't forget. So then you might ask, if 1,000 people tell a story for 1,000 years, what's left of the story? And the straightforward answer to that seems to be, well, it's the part of the story that nobody can forget. And that would be the part of the story that's most richly meaningful. Now, why precisely it would be richly meaningful, I think that's a whole different question, and I don't really know how to answer that. I think to some degree it echoes in people. You know, it's like, and we don't understand that exactly. You know, you go to a movie and the movie will reach a climax and all of a sudden it'll produce an emotional release in you. You know, maybe you'll start to cry. It doesn't mean you know exactly why. It's something in you is responding to it. So it's echoing in you in some sense. So you might even say that the structure of the story comes to match the structure of your caring. It's something like that. So it's a mirror of your psyche in some way. Adam and Eve. The first thing that happens is that they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So the first thing you might ask is, well, what is meant by naked and what is meant by ashamed? And so then you think, well, there's a number of things about people that are quite peculiar, and one is that we're clothed. And although there are some people who go about naked, it's not the standard human position in the world. In fact, you can actually trace the origin of cloth using the evolutionary structure of lice. Because there are some lice who have evolved to hold on to cloth and not hair. And they've tracked the DNA development, the genetic development of those lice back more than 25,000 years. So people use cloth and they use it well, they use it obviously for protection, but they also use it for all sorts of symbolic routines. But the point is that it does seem to be a particular human relationship with the idea of nakedness. Now, you might ask yourself, why? And what does it mean that the original people might have been naked and not ashamed? And why would that be a surprise to the readers? Because obviously one of the things that sentence presumes is that the reader is going to assume that the fact that the men and women who were naked were not ashamed is actually a deviation from the norm. So here's what I've made of it, and you can tell me what you think. First of all, they weren't self-conscious. Now you might ask, well, what would that have to do with nakedness? And I would say, well, a huge chunk of why people don't run around naked is because they're self-conscious. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, is that, well, human beings are standing up, first of all, unlike other animals, and so the most vulnerable parts of us are exposed not only to the world, but directly to the view of other people. And so most animals run around on all four, and that means they basically have armored backs, right? Their most vulnerable parts are not full center and front for everyone to see. So human beings also mate face to face, although they don't have to, and that also heightens self-consciousness. And then in relationship to shame, shame is actually an emotion that seems to be manifested under conditions of judgment. And so you might say, well, people are often afraid of public speaking. Why? You guys are afraid of public speaking. How many of you are afraid of public speaking? Okay, how many of you are completely comfortable with public speaking? Oh, that's good. That's quite amazing. So, okay, so why might people be afraid of public speaking? You bet. That's a lot of eyes looking at you. Right. And often people who are afraid of public speaking won't meet the eyes. They look down. And what that basically means is they're reacting to the crowd as if it's a predator. The best way to overcome that is to start looking at people. And you don't look at the crowd because there isn't a crowd. You look at individuals within the crowd. And then that's no problem because you know how to do that. It's a great way to decrease your fear of public speaking. Okay, so how about speaking in front of a crowd naked? That's a common nightmare, by the way. So what do you think about that? Sound like fun? No. Why? Why?
Even more scrutiny.
Right, and so what's the problem with the scrutiny?
It makes you self-conscious.
Why?
Because you're insecure.
Why?
Because you have flaws.
That's right, you have a lot of flaws and you're bloody well aware of them, you know, and it's bad enough to have your intellectual flaws revealed, but to add to that your physical flaws, you know, and you could think about that as your deviation from an implicit ideal. It's something like that. Right, people don't like that. That's why you never, except for the naked news, you never see that happening, or you virtually never see that happening except under very specific conditions. So part of the issue with being naked and ashamed is that the nakedness has to do with flaws. So you might say, well, what does it mean to see yourself as naked? Well, I think what it means is to see yourself with all your vulnerabilities. And that's like your local vulnerabilities, which just happens to be how hideous you are as a physical entity. But then there's even worse, which is if you're really self-conscious and aware of what it means to be vulnerable, because let's say that's what's at the core of nakedness, is you also realize your flawed and mortal nature across time. So that's partly the burden of the fact that you're physically imperfect and degenerating all at the same time. And that's something that human beings understand and that no other animal understands. It's a big deal. So I think partly the reason that we put on clothes is so we don't freeze to death when it's cold. But part of it also is to separate ourselves from continual scrutiny. A lot of that's going to be sexual scrutiny too and evaluation. We shield ourselves from that so that we can do some other things now and then. So the original people didn't have that problem. So I think they weren't self-conscious. That's the first thing to notice. So, okay,